Sometimes the worst monsters wear familiar faces and sit at the family table. For young Clara Brennan, that monster was her own uncle, the man who was supposed to protect her after her father died. In a small timber town where folks minded their business and looked the other way, she had nowhere to turn, until the day a mountain man came down from the high country. He was a man most people feared, a man who'd kept his distance for years, but he'd made a promise once to Clara's father, and he never forgot. When he saw what her uncle had done, everything changed. The mountain man planted his boot on the stair and said 5 words that froze the room. "Touch her again, and you're dead." What happened next left the whole town speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1883, and Pine Haven, Montana Territory, sat nestled in a valley where the timber grew thick and the winters came early. It was the kind of town that maps forgot, and strangers rarely found just a main street of weathered storefronts, a church with a leaning steeple, and enough saloons to keep the loggers busy when the work ran out. The mountains rose up on all sides like the walls of a great cathedral, and in those mountains, among the pine and granite, lived men who preferred the company of silence to the complications of civilization. Ezekiel Coleridge was one of those men. Most folks in Pine Haven called him Zeke, though few called him anything to his face. At 48 years old, he'd become something of a legend in 3 territories. A ghost who appeared in town twice a year for supplies and disappeared back into the high country before anyone could strike up more than a passing conversation. He was tall, lean in the way that hard living makes a man, with a beard gone grey at the edges and eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. Those eyes had seen things, done things, and when Zeke Coleridge looked at you with that flat, measuring gaze, you understood without words that crossing him would be the last mistake you ever made. But there was a time, years back, when Zeke had been different, when he'd had a wife named Emily and a son who never made it past his first winter. Fever took them both in the span of a week, and something in Zeke broke so completely that he never bothered trying to put it back together. He'd left his homestead, left everything that reminded him of warmth and family, and climbed into the mountains where the cold matched what he felt inside. That was 20 years ago. The only person who'd kept any kind of tether to Zeke's heart had been Thomas Brennan. They'd worked the timber camps together as young men before either had found wives or built futures. Thomas had a way about him, steady, honest, the kind of man who kept his word and expected others to do the same. When Zeke lost Emily and the boy, it was Thomas who'd climbed up to that mountain cabin and sat with him through the worst of the grief. Didn't say much, just sat. And when Zeke finally spoke weeks later, Thomas had simply nodded and said, "You come down when you're ready. I'll be here." Thomas Brennan had married a schoolteacher named Margaret, and together they'd had a daughter, Clara. She'd grown up with her father's steady temperament and her mother's quick mind, and by all accounts, she'd been the light of their lives. But life in the Montana Territory was hard and uncertain. Margaret took sick when Clara was 16, consumption that no amount of doctoring could cure. She died in the spring, when the wildflowers were just starting to bloom. Thomas had soldiered on, raising Clara alone, teaching her to read land deeds and manage accounts, skills most men didn't bother teaching their daughters. He'd wanted her to have options, to be able to stand on her own if the world demanded it. And for a few years, they'd managed. Thomas worked hard, saved carefully, and built a modest nest egg that would see Clara through if anything happened to him. Then, 3 years ago, Thomas Brennan came down with what Doc Harmon called a persistent fever. It started slow fatigue, loss of appetite, weakness that came and went. For months Thomas pushed through it, insisting he was fine, that it was just age catching up to him. But as winter set in, he grew worse. By January, he couldn't get out of bed. By February, he knew he was dying. That was when he sent for Zeke. It took 2 days for the message to reach the mountain cabin and another day for Zeke to make the journey down. He arrived to find his old friend wasted away to nothing, Clara sitting beside the bed with red-rimmed eyes and hands that shook when she tried to offer Zeke coffee. Thomas had rallied enough to speak, his voice thin but urgent. "I need you to promise me something," Thomas had said, gripping Zeke's arm with what little strength he had left. "Clara's got no one but my brother Silas, and I don't trust him, Zeke. Never have. He's got a mean streak and an eye for money that ain't his." Thomas coughed, and Clara had dabbed at his lips with a cloth. "Promise me, you'll look after her, not take her in. She's got her own mind and won't be beholden, but watch over her. Make sure Silas doesn't—" He'd broken off, coughing again, and when he spoke next, his eyes were fierce. "Promise me, Zeke, on Emily's memory. Promise me you won't let harm come to my girl." Zeke had promised. He'd given his word, clasped Thomas's hand, and watched his old friend slip away 2 days later. At the funeral, Silas Brennan had stood at the graveside with an expression that managed to be both mournful and calculating. He was Thomas's older brother by 5 years, but where Thomas had been solid and honest, Silas was slick and ambitious. He'd made his money in loans and land deals, operating out of a timber frame house on the edge of town that was bigger than it needed to be. Silas had never married, claimed he'd never found a woman who could match his standards, but the truth was that most women in Pinehaven saw right through him. After the funeral, Silas had taken Clara into his home. It was the expected thing, the proper thing. A young woman of 20 couldn't live alone, and Silas was her only living relative. The town had nodded approvingly, relieved that the situation had resolved itself so neatly. But Zeke had seen the way Silas looked at Clara's inheritance, at the small savings Thomas had left behind. He'd seen the glint in those pale eyes and felt his gut tighten with warning. Still, he'd kept his distance. Clara was a grown woman, and Silas was her blood. Zeke had no legal standing, no right to interfere. So he'd returned to his cabin and tried to trust that the promise wouldn't be needed. He'd been wrong. Clara Brennan, now 22, had spent 3 years in her uncle's house, and they'd been 3 years of slow suffocation. At first, Silas had been almost kind, overly solicitous, hovering, making sure she had everything she needed. But kindness had given way to control. He'd dismissed the few suitors who'd come calling, claiming they weren't good enough, weren't established enough. He'd taken over management of her inheritance, saying she didn't understand financial matters. He'd insisted she help with his business affairs, keeping his books and writing his correspondence, all while paying her nothing and reminding her constantly that she owed him for taking her in. And then the control had turned to cruelty. It started with small things, harsh words, impossible standards, criticism that cut deeper than it should. Then came the restrictions. Clara wasn't allowed to visit friends without permission. She couldn't go to church socials. She certainly couldn't leave town, not even for a day. Silas watched her like a hawk, and when she pushed back, when she dared to question his authority, he'd learned that a hard hand could enforce obedience. The first time he'd struck her, Clara had been too shocked to react. The second time, she'd tried to fight back, and that had only made it worse. By the third time, she'd learned to stay quiet, to keep her head down, to hide the bruises under long sleeves and high collars. The town knew, of course. In a place as small as Pinehaven, secrets were hard to keep, but knowing and acting were different things entirely. Silas Brennan held mortgages on half the properties in town. He'd made loans to struggling families, investments in failing businesses, and he collected those debts with ruthless efficiency. Cross Silas, and you might find your loan called in early. Speak against him, and your family might suffer. So people looked away. They saw Clara's haunted eyes and the careful way she moved, and they convinced themselves it wasn't their business. Doc Harmon knew. He'd treated a sprained wrist, cracked ribs, bruises that couldn't be explained away by clumsiness. But Doc Harmon was 70 years old, and Silas had helped him avoid foreclosure on his practice 5 years back. The debt was legal and binding, and speaking up would mean losing everything. Sarah Winters knew. She ran the general store with her husband, and she'd watched Clara grow from a bright-eyed girl into a woman who flinched at sudden movements. Sarah had tried, carefully, to offer help, a kind word, a pressed flower, a moment of genuine human warmth. But Clara had learned not to accept comfort, because comfort led to questions, and questions led to consequences. Sheriff Polk knew. He'd been called to the Brennan house twice on reports of disturbances, and both times Silas had smooth-talked him right back out the door. Polk was a practical man who understood which side his bread was buttered on. Silas Brennan was the most powerful man in Pinehaven, and sheriffs who wanted to keep their positions learned not to make enemies of powerful men. So Clara had endured. She'd survived, and she'd started to plan. 3 months ago, she'd begun hiding money. Small amounts, skimmed from the household accounts where Silas wouldn't notice. A few dollars here, a few there, tucked away in a tin beneath a loose floorboard in her room. Along with the money, she'd hidden her mother's wedding ring, the one thing Silas hadn't managed to sell or confiscate, and a torn piece of paper with an address in San Francisco where a cousin of her mother's lived. Clara's plan was simple: save enough for a train ticket, wait for Silas to travel on business, and run. She'd get to San Francisco, find her mother's cousin, and start over. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was hope, and hope was all she had left. She should have known that Silas would find out. She should have known that men like him always found out. The day everything changed started like any other late September morning. Silas had left the house early to meet with a land speculator from Helena, leaving Clara alone with instructions to organize his study and prepare correspondence for 3 overdue loan collections. She'd waited until his horse disappeared around the bend, counted to 100 to be sure, then climbed the stairs to her room. The tin was exactly where she'd left it, wedged beneath the loose floorboard under her bed. Clara pulled it out with trembling hands and counted the contents for the 100th time. $43.70. Not a fortune, but enough. The train ticket to San Francisco would cost $32. That left her enough for food, for a few nights in a boarding house while she found her mother's cousin for a fresh start. She'd tucked the money into a cloth pouch and sewn it into the lining of her traveling coat. Her mother's wedding ring went into her dress pocket, wrapped in a handkerchief. She'd packed a small carpet bag with 2 changes of clothes, her father's photograph, and the battered copy of Whitman's poems her mother had loved. Everything else, the life she'd built, the memories of happier times, would have to stay behind. The train left at 2 o'clock. Clara had planned to walk to the station, buy her ticket, and be gone before Silas returned from his meeting. Simple, clean, final. She made it as far as the front door. Silas's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade. "Going somewhere, niece?" Clara's blood turned to ice. She turned slowly to find her uncle standing in the doorway of his study, still wearing his coat and hat. He hadn't left at all. He'd been waiting, watching, testing her. "I was just—" Clara started, but Silas crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and ripped the carpet bag from her hand. He upended it on the floor. Her clothes tumbled out, along with the photograph and the book. Silas kicked through the pile with his boot, then turned his attention to Clara herself. His hands were rough as he patted her coat, and when his fingers found the sewn-in pouch, his expression shifted from anger to something far more dangerous. "What's this?" He tore the pouch free, ripping the fabric. The coins spilled across the floorboards in a bright cascade. Silas stared at the money, then at Clara, and his face went white with rage. "You've been stealing from me." "It's not stealing," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "That's my money, my inheritance. You've been taking it for 3 years. The slap came so fast she didn't see it coming. Clara's head snapped to the side, and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. She staggered but didn't fall. "Your inheritance?" Silas grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Everything you have is because I took you in, fed you, clothed you, and this is how you repay me?" by sneaking around like a thief. "My father left me that money," Clara said, and she heard the shake in her own voice but pushed through it. "He wanted me to have choices. To be able to. Your father was a fool who died penniless." Silas shook her hard enough to rattle her teeth. "I'm the one who's been managing your affairs. I'm the one who's kept this household running. And you—" He shoved her backward into the wall. "You're nothing but an ungrateful burden." Clara's hand went to her pocket, feeling for her mother's ring, but Silas saw the movement. He grabbed her wrist and twisted until she cried out, then wrenched the handkerchief free. The ring tumbled into his palm. "Well, well." Silas held it up to the light, examining it. "I'd wondered where this had gone. Margaret's wedding ring, worth at least $50, I'd say. That's mine." Clara whispered, "Please, it's all I have left of her." Silas pocketed the ring without a second glance. Then he grabbed Clara by the shoulders and marched her toward the stairs. "You want to leave so badly? Fine. I've got a better plan. There's a man coming from Helena tomorrow, Frederick Marsh. He's looking for a wife, and he's willing to pay handsomely for one who can read and write and keep his accounts." Clara's stomach dropped. "You're selling me. I'm arranging a marriage." Silas forced her up the stairs, his grip bruising. "Marsh will pay off what your father owed me, plus a generous finder's fee. You'll marry him next week, and you'll be his problem instead of mine." "No." Clara tried to pull free, but Silas was stronger. "No, I won't. You'll do exactly as you're told." They'd reached her room, and Silas shoved her inside so hard she fell to her knees. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone in this town knows what a whore your mother was. I'll tell them how Margaret Brennan spread her legs for half the timber camp before Thomas was fool enough to marry her." "That's a lie." Clara scrambled to her feet, rage overwhelming fear. "My mother was—" Silas backhanded her across the face, and this time Clara did fall. Her vision swam, and when it cleared, her uncle was standing over her with his belt in his hand. "You'll stay in this room until Marsh arrives," Silas said, his voice cold and final. "And if you try to leave, if you make a sound, if you do anything but sit quietly and think about your sins, I'll take this belt to you until you can't walk. Do you understand me?" Clara tasted blood and tears and fury, but she nodded. There was no point in fighting. Not now. Not when he had all the power and she had none. Silas slammed the door, and Clara heard the key turn in the lock. Then his footsteps retreated down the stairs, and she was alone. She sat on the floor for a long time, her face throbbing, her wrists aching. The room felt like a coffin, the walls pressed in. 3 years of endurance, of survival, of quiet suffering, and it had come to this. She would be married off to a stranger, a man who'd paid for her like livestock, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Unless... Clara pulled herself to her feet and went to the window. Her room overlooked the back of the house, where the forest crept close to the property line. Beyond those trees, miles and miles of wilderness stretched up into the mountains. And somewhere up there, in a cabin she'd never seen, lived the man her father had trusted above all others, Ezekiel Coleridge. Clara had met him exactly once, at her father's funeral. He'd stood at the back of the small gathering, silent and still as a standing stone, and when the service ended, he'd approached her briefly. "Your father was a good man," he'd said, his voice rough with disuse. "If you ever need anything." But Silas had interrupted, placing a possessive hand on Clara's shoulder and dismissing Zeke with barely concealed contempt. Zeke had looked at Clara then with those flat, measuring eyes, and something in his gaze had made her feel seen for the first time since her father died. Then he'd nodded once and walked away, back toward the mountains, and Clara hadn't seen him since. But her father had trusted him, had made him promise something, though Clara hadn't known what at the time. And now, locked in her room with a forced marriage looming and nowhere else to turn, she understood that Zeke Coleridge might be her only hope. The problem was getting word to him. Clara had no way to leave her room, no way to send a message. Silas would keep her locked up until Frederick Marsh arrived, and then it would be too late. She sank onto her bed and let the tears come, silent and bitter. She'd tried to save herself, tried to escape, and all she'd accomplished was making everything worse. The money was gone. Her mother's ring was gone. Her freedom was gone. And in a week's time, she'd belonged to a stranger who'd bought her from her uncle like a piece of property. Clara didn't pray often anymore. God had seemed terribly absent these past 3 years, but she prayed now. Not for rescue. Exactly. She was past believing in miracles, but for strength, for courage, for the will to endure whatever came next. She didn't know that someone had already seen her uncle's rage. Didn't know that Doc Harmon had been passing by the house on his morning rounds and heard the shouting, the sound of violence, the slam of a door. She didn't know that the old doctor had stood on that street corner, torn between duty and fear, before finally making a decision that would change everything. And she certainly didn't know that 3 days later a message would reach a cabin high in the mountains, carried by a boy brave enough to make the climb. A message that said simply, "She needs you. Come now." By the time Ezekiel Coleridge received that message, Clara would have a split lip, a blackened eye, and bruises up and down her arms from where Silas had disciplined her for trying to force the door. She would have spent 72 hours in that locked room, listening to her uncle make arrangements for her future, hearing him laugh with Frederick Marsh over whiskey and cigars in the parlor below. But she would also have something else, a small, stubborn flame of hope that refused to die. Because somewhere in the back of her mind, she remembered her father's words from years ago, spoken when she was just a girl. "Zeke Coleridge is the kind of man who keeps his promises, Clara, no matter what they cost him." And Thomas Brennan had never lied to his daughter, not once, not ever. The Winters' home sat above their general store, a modest apartment with slanted ceilings and windows that let in good light. Sarah had set Clara up in the spare room, the one that had belonged to Jimmy before he'd grown tall enough to prefer sleeping in the storage loft downstairs. It was small but clean, with a quilt his grandmother had made, and a view of the mountains that Clara could see when she sat up in bed. For 3 days, Clara barely left that room. Doc Harmon came and went, treating her bruises with salve and her split lip with careful stitches. Sarah brought soup and bread and sat with her in comfortable silence. And Zeke stayed in Pinehaven, taking a room at the boarding house and trying to figure out what came next. He wasn't used to waiting. In the mountains, problems were straightforward. A bear threatened your territory. You dealt with it. A storm was coming. You prepared. But this situation with Clara and Silas was like trying to grab smoke. Every time he thought he had a handle on it, it shifted. On the 4th day, Clara came downstairs. She moved carefully, still favoring her ribs, but there was something different in her bearing. The wariness was still there, but so was a spark of determination that reminded Zeke powerfully of Thomas. Mr. Coleridge. She found him sitting at the table in the store's back room, drinking coffee with Sarah. "I need to go back to my uncle's house." Sarah's hand went to her chest. "Absolutely not. I need my things." Clara's voice was steady. "My mother's photographs, my father's papers." And she hesitated. "There's something else. Something I found before everything happened. Evidence of what my uncle's been doing." Zeke set down his coffee cup. "What kind of evidence?" "A ledger, hidden in his study." Clara sat down across from him, and Zeke noticed she'd borrowed one of Sarah's simpler dresses. It hung a bit loose on her, but the color brought out her eyes. "It documents years of fraud, forged signatures, manipulated loan terms, properties seized under false pretenses. There are dozens of families in this town who've been cheated, and it's all recorded in that ledger." "You've seen this ledger?" Zeke asked. Clara nodded. "I took it the day I tried to leave. I hid it with my things, but when Silas caught me," she stopped, swallowing hard. "I don't know if he found it. If he didn't, it's still there. And if we can get it, we can prove what he's been doing." Sarah leaned forward. Clara, even if the ledger is still there, going back is too dangerous. She's right, Zeke agreed. Silas won't let you just walk in and take what you want. Then I'll sneak in, Clara's jaw set stubbornly. I know that house. I know when Silas is usually out, where he keeps his keys, how to get in through the back kitchen window. I can do this. No. Zeke's voice was flat. I'll go. You don't know where to look, so tell me. Clara shook her head. It's not that simple. The ledger is hidden behind a false panel in his study. You have to know exactly where to press to release it. And if Silas has moved it since I was there... She met Zeke's eyes. I need to be the one to go, but I was hoping you might come with me. Zeke studied her for a long moment. She was scared, he could see it in the tension around her eyes, but she wasn't backing down. And he realized, with something like respect, that Clara Brennan wasn't just a victim to be protected. She was Thomas's daughter, with all the stubbornness and courage that implied. When? He asked. Tomorrow afternoon. Silas has a meeting with the timber company representatives. It's scheduled for 2 o'clock and usually runs until 4. That gives us a window. Sarah looked between them, clearly unhappy but recognizing she'd been outvoted. If you're going to do this, at least be smart about it. Take the back paths. And for heaven's sake, be quick. The next afternoon, Zeke and Clara approached the Brennan house from the wooded side, where the trees grew close to the property. True to her word, Clara knew the route well, leading him through a narrow gap in the hedge and across the kitchen garden to a window that looked like it hadn't been properly latched in years. She opened it with practiced ease and climbed through. Zeke followed, his larger frame making the maneuver awkward, and found himself in a kitchen that smelled of old grease and neglect. Clara moved through the house like a ghost, her feet knowing exactly which floorboards creaked and which were safe. They reached Silas's study without incident. It was a large room, dominated by a heavy oak desk and shelves lined with legal books Zeke suspected had never been opened. Clara went straight to the wall behind the desk and began pressing along the paneling, her fingers searching for something only she could find. "Here," she whispered. There was a soft click, and a section of the panel swung open, revealing a small cavity behind it. Clara reached in and pulled out a leather-bound ledger, thick with papers and brittle with age. "Got it." Zeke glanced at the door, listening. The house was quiet, but that could change in an instant. "Let's go." But as Clara turned to leave, something else in the hidden cavity caught her eye. She reached in again and pulled out a small tin, the same one she'd kept her escape money in. "He didn't throw it away," she murmured, almost to herself. She opened the tin, and Zeke saw her mother's wedding ring nestled inside. Clara's hand shook as she took the ring, slipping it onto her finger. Then she noticed something else in the tin, a photograph, old and faded. She pulled it out, and her breath caught. "What is it?" Zeke asked quietly. Clara held the photograph up to the light, filtering through the study's window. It showed 3 men standing together, arms slung over each other's shoulders in the easy camaraderie of friends or colleagues. One was clearly Silas, younger but still recognizable. The second was a well-dressed man Zeke didn't know. The third, "That's Sheriff Larkin," Clara whispered. "The sheriff before Polk. He died 5 years ago. They said it was an accident, a fall from his horse." Zeke took the photograph, examining it more closely. On the back, someone had written a date and location: Helena Land Office, March 1878. And below that, in different handwriting, "The last honest lawman in Pinehaven." "Why would Silas keep this?" Clara asked. Zeke's mind was already working through the implications. Either as a trophy or as insurance. Some men like to keep reminders of their victories. Others keep evidence in case they need leverage. "You think Silas had something to do with Sheriff Larkin's death?" "I think your uncle is capable of a lot of things." Zeke handed the photograph back to her. "And I think this ledger just became a lot more important. We need to go. Now." They made it back to the kitchen window without incident. Clara climbed through first, and Zeke was halfway out when he heard the front door open. Silas's voice carried through the house, angry and complaining to someone about the incompetence of the timber company representatives. Zeke froze, one leg still inside the house, his heart hammering. If Silas came to the kitchen... But Clara grabbed his arm and pulled, and Zeke managed to get through the window just as footsteps approached. They ran, low and fast, across the kitchen garden and into the cover of the trees. Behind them, Zeke heard Silas's voice rising in a bellow of rage. He'd discovered the study, discovered the missing ledger. "Keep moving," Zeke urged Clara, and they plunged deeper into the woods. They didn't stop until they'd put a mile between themselves and the house, following a creek bed that would hide their tracks. Only then did Clara allow herself to sink down onto a fallen log, the ledger clutched to her chest and her breath coming in gasps. "He knows," she said. "He knows we have it. Let him know." Zeke sat down beside her, his own breathing steady despite the run. "The question is what we do with it now." Clara opened the ledger, and they spent the next hour going through its contents. Page after page documented Silas's crimes, names, dates, amounts stolen or extorted. It was damning evidence, the kind that could put him in prison for the rest of his life. But as Zeke read, he noticed something else. Many of the victims listed in the ledger were people he recognized, families who still lived in Pinehaven, who'd lost their land or their savings to Silas's schemes and never fought back. People who'd been too afraid or too broken to stand up for themselves. "We need to show this to these people," Clara said, echoing his thoughts. "They deserve to know the truth. They deserve to have the chance to speak up." "Some of them won't want to," Zeke warned. "Fear is a powerful thing, and Silas has built his power on making people afraid. Then we start with the ones who are brave enough." Clara closed the ledger and looked at him with those eyes that were so much like Thomas's. "My father used to say that courage is contagious, that one person standing up can inspire 10 others to do the same." Zeke found himself smiling slightly. He did say that, usually right before he did something reckless. Was he right? Zeke thought about Jimmy Winters climbing a mountain to deliver a message, about Doc Harmon risking Silas's wrath to send for help, about Sarah opening her home to Clara despite the consequences, about Clara herself, beaten and broken but still fighting. "Yeah," he said quietly. He was right. They walked back to the Winters' store as dusk was settling over Pinehaven. Sarah met them at the door, pale with worry. "Thank God. Silas has been through town twice looking for you. He's furious." "Good," Clara said, and there was steel in her voice. "Let him be furious. We have the ledger, and we're going to use it." That evening, in the back room of the general store, they made their plan. Doc Harmon came, and so did a few others, people who'd suffered at Silas's hands and were finally ready to speak up. They went through the ledger together, each victim finding their own story documented in Silas's neat, damning handwriting. And as Zeke watched them, watched the anger and the grief and the growing determination on their faces, he understood something he'd forgotten during his years of isolation. Thomas had been right about courage being contagious, but he'd also been right about something else, that sometimes the most important thing one person can do is simply refuse to be afraid. It wasn't enough to protect Clara. Wasn't enough to just keep her safe and hope Silas would leave them alone. The only way to truly end this was to expose him, to bring his crimes into the light and let the community decide what justice looked like. It was going to be dangerous. Silas wouldn't go down without a fight. But looking at Clara's determined face, at the small group of allies gathering around them, Zeke felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Hope, and the chance, perhaps, at redemption. Zeke hadn't planned on staying at his cabin with Clara, but when Silas's men started prowling around Pinehaven asking questions, Sarah Winters had insisted it was the only safe option. "They're watching my store," she'd said, wringing her hands. "And Doc Harmon's place too. They're looking for her, Zeke. You need to take her somewhere they can't reach. So here they were, 3 days into an arrangement that felt both necessary and impossibly complicated. The cabin that had been Zeke's fortress of solitude now held another person, a young woman who was learning to navigate both the practical challenges of mountain living and the emotional aftermath of what she'd endured. Clara was proving more resilient than Zeke had expected. She'd adapted quickly to the routine of the cabin, learning to manage the wood stove, haul water from the creek, and move through the small space without getting in his way. They'd fallen into an unspoken rhythm, Zeke rising early to check his trap lines and hunt, Clara using the quiet hours to organize the evidence from the ledger and write detailed accounts of each victim's case. But it was the evenings that undid him. After the sun went down and the work was done, they'd sit by the fire and talk. At first, the conversations had been practical plans for confronting Silas, strategies for getting the federal marshal involved, discussions about what would happen after. But gradually, as Clara grew more comfortable, the talks had deepened. She'd asked about his life before the mountains, about Emily and the son he'd lost, about how he'd met Thomas and why they'd become such close friends. And Zeke, who'd spent 20 years not talking about any of it, found himself answering, found himself sharing stories he'd thought were buried too deep to resurface. In return, he'd learned about Clara not just the suffering of the past 3 years, but the person she'd been before. The girl who'd loved mathematics and could calculate land surveys in her head. The daughter who'd read every book in her father's modest library twice over. The young woman who'd dreamed of teaching, of maybe opening a school where girls could learn more than just sewing and scripture. "Do you still want that?" Zeke had asked. "To teach?" Clara had stared into the fire for a long moment. "I don't know what I want anymore. 3 years ago I had plans. Now, I'm just trying to figure out how to exist in the world without feeling like I'm about to break." Zeke had understood that feeling all too well. On the 4th evening, Clara found the compass. Zeke had stepped outside to check on the horses, and when he returned, she was holding the silver compass, turning it over in her hands and reading the inscription on the back. "To Zeke, true north never lies. T. B." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "My father gave you this." Zeke nodded, unable to find words. He'd carried that compass for 15 years, through seasons and storms, and it had never failed to point him home. Even when home was nothing but an empty cabin and memories that hurt to remember. "He had one too," Clara said softly. "A compass, I mean. My mother gave it to him on their wedding day. He always said that she was his true north, that no matter how lost he got, she'd guide him back. He was a lucky man, to have that kind of love. Were you?" Clara set the compass down carefully on the table between them. "Lucky, I mean." "With Emily." Zeke sat down across from her, the firelight casting shadows across his weathered face. "For a little while. Yeah, I was. What was she like?" No one had asked him that in 20 years. People either avoided the subject entirely or offered useless platitudes about God's plan and better places. But Clara asked like she genuinely wanted to know, like Emily had been a real person worth remembering rather than just a tragedy to be mourned. She was stubborn, Zeke said, and despite the ache in his chest he found himself almost smiling. Had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. She could outshoot half the men in the territory and could read people like they were books written in large print. He paused, remembering. She saw through me right away. Saw past the tough man act to the scared kid underneath. And instead of running, she stayed. Decided I was worth the effort. She sounds wonderful. She was. Zeke picked up the compass, felt its familiar weight in his palm. And when she died, when I lost them both, I couldn't figure out how to keep going. Everything hurt. Everything reminded me. So I ran. Came up here where the quiet was so complete it drowned out my own thoughts. Did it work? For a while. Zeke set the compass down again. But quiet isn't the same as peace. I learned that too late. Clara was quiet for a moment, then she said, "My father blamed himself for my mother's death. Did you know that?" Zeke shook his head. "She got sick helping at the schoolhouse. There was an outbreak of consumption, and she insisted on nursing the children because no one else would. My father begged her not to go, said it was too dangerous, but she went anyway, and she got sick." Clara's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. He spent the rest of his life thinking that if he'd just insisted harder, if he'd been more forceful, she'd still be alive. That wasn't his fault. I know, and I tried to tell him that. But guilt doesn't listen to logic. She met his eyes across the table. "Is that why you stayed up here so long? Guilt?" The question landed like a physical blow, and Zeke realized with uncomfortable clarity that Clara saw through him just as completely as Emily once had. "Maybe. Yeah, probably. What are you guilty about? Not being there, not saving them." Zeke's throat felt tight. "Not being strong enough to survive, losing them without falling apart." "You survived," Clara said gently. "You're still here. That counts for something." "I didn't really survive. I just existed. There's a difference." Clara reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact since he'd brought her to the cabin, and the gesture was so unexpected that Zeke froze. "You came down the mountain for me," she said. "You kept the promise you made to my father. You're helping me fight back against Silas. That's not just existing, Mr. Coleridge. That's living." Zeke looked at their hands, his scarred and weathered, hers smaller but bearing her own scars, and felt something shift inside him. Something that had been frozen for 20 years, beginning painfully to thaw. "You can call me Zeke," he said quietly. "I think we're past formalities." Clara smiled, and it transformed her face. "All right. Zeke." They sat like that for a while, the fire crackling and the night settling around the cabin, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Zeke didn't feel alone. The next morning, Zeke found Clara outside, practicing with her father's rifle. She'd been at it for an hour, and her form was improving. He watched her sight down the barrel at a target he'd set up a piece of bark marked with charcoal and squeeze the trigger. The shot went wide, but not by much. "You're pulling to the left," Zeke said, stepping up beside her. "Here, let me show you." He positioned himself behind her, adjusting her stance and the placement of her hands on the rifle. "Breathe in, let half of it out, then squeeze. Don't pull, squeeze." Clara tried again, and this time the shot punched through the edge of the target. "I hit it." "You did." Zeke stepped back, fighting the urge to smile at her enthusiasm. "Keep practicing. You've got your father's steady hand." They spent the rest of the morning like that, Zeke teaching, Clara learning. And somewhere in the process, something passed between them that was more than just instruction. It was trust. It was connection. It was the recognition that they were both broken people learning, slowly, how to be whole again. That afternoon, as they sat on the cabin's small porch eating a lunch of cornbread and beans, Clara said, "Do you ever think about staying? Not in the cabin, I mean, but down in Pine Haven, being part of the town again?" Zeke considered the question. A week ago, he'd have said no without hesitation. But now, with Clara beside him and a purpose beyond mere survival pulling at him, he wasn't so sure. "I don't know if I'd fit there anymore," he said honestly. "My father fit, and you two weren't so different. Your father was a better man than me." Clara looked at him with those clear-seeing eyes. "I'm not sure that's true. But even if it were, people can change. Can become better, can't they?" Zeke met her gaze and saw the question behind the question. She wasn't just asking about him. She was asking about herself. Asking if someone who'd been broken could be put back together. Asking if survival could become something more. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think they can." Clara smiled again, and Zeke realized with a start that he'd been working unconsciously to make her smile. that her happiness had become somehow important to him in a way that went beyond Thomas's promise. It should have scared him, should have sent him retreating back into the safe numbness of isolation. But instead, he just sat there in the afternoon sun, watching Clara clean her father's rifle with careful attention and let himself feel something he'd thought was gone forever. Hope, connection, and the terrifying tentative possibility of caring about someone again. The attack came on the 6th day. Zeke had been tracking elk in the high meadow when he heard the shot's 3 rapid cracks that echoed off the mountainside. Too regular to be hunting, too purposeful. His blood went cold, and he was running before his conscious mind caught up, his rifle in one hand and his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached the cabin clearing to find Clara pressed against the back wall, her father's rifle in her hands, facing down 4 men on horseback. Silas's men, he recognized 2 of them from town. They had their weapons drawn, but hadn't fired again. Perhaps because Clara had already proven she could shoot back. "That's far enough," Clara called out, her voice steady despite the situation. "Next man who moves gets a bullet." The lead rider, a hard-faced man named Garrett, laughed. "You think you can take all 4 of us, girl? Mr. Brennan just wants to talk. Wants to work out an arrangement. The arrangement is that you turn around and ride back down," Zeke said, stepping from the tree line with his rifle already raised and aimed at Garrett's chest. "And you tell Silas that if he sends men after Clara again, they won't ride back." Garrett's expression shifted from amusement to calculation. "Coleridge, we don't want trouble with you, but Mr. Brennan has legal rights to his niece, and she's got something that belongs to him." "The ledger doesn't belong to him," Clara said. "It belongs to all the people he's stolen from. That's between her and Mr. Brennan. We're just here to escort her back to town for a conversation. She's not going anywhere with you." Zeke's finger moved to the trigger. "Last chance. Ride away." For a moment, the clearing hung in perfect tension, 4 armed men on one side, Zeke and Clara on the other, and the mathematics of violence calculating in everyone's minds. Then Garrett made a mistake. He glanced at the man beside him, giving a subtle nod, and Zeke saw the decision form. The second man went for his gun. Zeke's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him off his horse. Clara fired at nearly the same instant, and another man yelped as his horse reared. The remaining 2 men scattered, spurring their horses into the trees as Zeke fired again, the shot close enough to one rider's head that he heard the man curse. Then it was over. The wounded man lay on the ground, groaning and clutching his shoulder. His companion had managed to stay mounted, but was hunched over, blood seeping through his sleeve where Clara's bullet had grazed him. The other 2 men were gone, crashing through the underbrush in retreat. Zeke kept his rifle trained on the wounded men as he approached. "Clara, you all right?" "I'm fine." Her voice was shaking now, the adrenaline catching up with her. "I'm fine. I just did. I kill him?" "No. You winged him. Good shooting, considering." Zeke reached the man on the ground and kicked his weapon away. "You, what's your name?" "Porter." The man gasped, his face pale with pain and blood loss. "Tom Porter." "Well, Tom Porter, you're going to ride back to town and give Silas a message. Tell him the next men he sends won't get a warning shot. Tell him I'm done playing nice, and tell him—" Zeke crouched down, his voice dropping to something cold and final. "Tell him that Clara Brennan is under my protection, and I will kill anyone who tries to take her. You understand?" Porter nodded frantically, and Zeke hauled him to his feet, helping him onto his horse with rough efficiency. The other wounded man was already mounted, looking like he might pass out. At any moment. "Get moving," Zeke said, "and count yourselves lucky I let you leave alive." They rode off, slower than they'd arrived, and Zeke watched until they disappeared down the mountain trail. Only then did he turn to Clara, who'd lowered her rifle and was standing with her arms wrapped around herself, shaking. "Hey." Zeke approached carefully, the way he would a spooked horse. "You did good. You held them off until I got back." I was terrified. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. I thought they were going to, but they didn't. You stood your ground, and you protected yourself. Zeke gently took the rifle from her trembling hands. That takes courage. Clara looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with tears. I don't feel brave. I feel... She broke off as the tears spilled over, and before Zeke could think better of it, he pulled her into his arms. She stiffened for just a moment, then collapsed against him, her face pressed to his chest as sobs shook her body. Zeke held her, one hand on her back and the other cradling her head, and let her cry. He didn't offer platitudes or tell her everything would be fine. He just held her and let her be afraid, because she'd earned the right to feel what she felt. When the storm passed, Clara pulled back, wiping at her eyes with embarrassment. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Don't apologize. Zeke's voice was rough. You've been holding yourself together for days. Sometimes you need to let it out. Clara nodded, then looked around the clearing. They'll come back, won't they? Silas won't stop. No, he won't. Zeke felt the weight of that truth settle on his shoulders, which means we can't stay here anymore. We need to go on offense. Need to take the fight to him before he brings it to us. How? Zeke thought for a moment, his mind working through possibilities. We call a town meeting, present the ledger publicly. Make sure everyone knows what Silas has done. Once the truth is out there, he loses his power. You think people will believe us? I think people will believe evidence, and we've got plenty of it. Zeke started toward the cabin, his decision made. Pack your things. We're going back to Pinehaven tonight. Inside the cabin, as they gathered their belongings, Clara said quietly, Thank you for being here. She gestured vaguely. For everything. Zeke paused in his packing, meeting her eyes. Your father asked me to protect you. I'm just keeping my word. Is that all this is? Clara's voice was soft but steady. A promise to my father? The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Zeke could have lied, could have kept things simple and safe. But looking at Clara, at this woman who'd been beaten down and had risen back up, who'd faced armed men without flinching, who'd somehow managed to make him feel alive again, he couldn't. No, he said honestly. It's not just that anymore. Clara held his gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Then she nodded and went back to packing, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. They left the cabin as dusk was falling, taking the back trails that would bring them into Pinehaven after dark. Zeke's mind was already working through the logistics they'd need to get the ledger to Doc Harmon for safekeeping, round up the people willing to testify, and arrange for the town meeting. It would take coordination and timing and a bit of luck, but as they rode, Clara suddenly pulled up her horse. Zeke, wait. There's something in the ledger I need to check. She dismounted and pulled out the leather-bound book, flipping through pages by the fading light. Zeke watched her, puzzled, until she found what she was looking for and went absolutely still. What is it? Clara looked up at him, and her face was pale. There's an entry here I didn't notice before. She swallowed hard. It's about my father. Zeke dismounted and went to her side, looking over her shoulder at the page she indicated. There, in Silas's neat handwriting, was an entry dated 3 years ago. Next to Thomas Brennan's name was a list of transactions, loans supposedly taken out, interest supposedly accrued, debts supposedly owed. But below that, in the margin, was another notation in different ink. Arsenic. Small doses. 6 months should do it. Make it look natural. The words hit Zeke like a physical blow. He'd suspected, in the back of his mind, that Thomas's death hadn't been entirely natural. But seeing it confirmed, seeing the cold calculation of murder written out like a business transaction, made his blood run cold with rage. He killed my father. Clara's voice was shaking. He poisoned him slowly, so it would look like fever. All so he could get control of me and my inheritance. Zeke took the ledger, reading the entry again to make sure he wasn't imagining it. But it was there, damning and clear. Silas Brennan hadn't just stolen from people. He'd committed murder. Premeditated, calculated murder. This changes everything, Zeke said quietly. This isn't just fraud anymore. This is why he's so desperate to get the ledger back. Clara looked up at him, and her grief was transforming into something harder. He's not just protecting his reputation or his business, he's protecting himself from a hanging. Zeke carefully tore the page from the ledger, folding it and tucking it into his shirt pocket. We need to get this to someone with authority. Real authority. Not Sheriff Polk, who's in Silas's pocket, but the federal marshal in Helena, Clara finished. That's who we should have gone to from the start. Helena's 5 days away, and Silas knows we have this now. He'll be watching the roads. They stood in the gathering darkness, the enormity of what they'd discovered settling over them. Silas Brennan was a murderer. Thomas had been killed slowly, painfully, by his own brother, and Clara had spent 3 years in that murderer's house, under his control, subject to his cruelty. I want him to pay. Clara's voice was hard as stone. I want everyone to know what he did. I want him to face justice for my father's death. He will. Zeke placed his hand on her shoulder, meeting her fierce gaze. I promise you, Clara, he will pay for what he's done. To your father, to you, to everyone he's hurt. Clara nodded, and they remounted their horses. But as they continued down the mountain, Zeke's mind was racing. The discovery of Thomas's murder changed the stakes completely. This wasn't just about protecting Clara anymore, or about exposing a corrupt businessman. This was about bringing a killer to justice. And Zeke knew, with cold certainty, that Silas would do anything to prevent that from happening, including killing again. They needed to be smart, needed to be careful, but most of all, they needed to move fast, before Silas realized what they knew and tried to destroy the evidence or them. The town meeting would have to wait. First, they needed to get word to the federal marshal, and they needed to make sure Clara stayed alive long enough for justice to be served. Because Silas Brennan had gotten away with murder once, Zeke would die before letting him get away with it again. They reached Pine Haven just after midnight, taking the back paths to avoid being seen. The town was dark and quiet, with only a few lanterns burning in windows where late workers or worried parents kept watch. Zeke and Clara stabled their horses behind the general store and made their way up the back stairs to the Winters' apartment. Sarah opened the door before they could knock, her face drawn with worry. Thank God. We heard about the shooting at your cabin. Is it true? Did Silas send men after you? He did. Zeke ushered Clara inside and closed the door firmly behind them. And he'll send more. We need to move fast. Doc Harmon was there too. Along with Jimmy Winters and 3 other townspeople, Zeke recognized from previous meetings the Hutchinsons, who'd lost their farm to Silas's schemes, and a widow named Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry and had been paying inflated interest on a loan for 5 years. They all looked up as Zeke and Clara entered, hope and fear warring on their faces. Tell them, Clara said quietly to Zeke. Tell them what we found. Zeke pulled out the page he'd torn from the ledger and laid it on the table. The group gathered around, reading in silence. When they finished, Mrs. Chen crossed herself and whispered something in Chinese that Zeke didn't understand but recognized as a prayer. He murdered his own brother. Doc Harmon's voice shook with rage and grief. I suspected, God help me. I suspected something wasn't right about Thomas's death. The symptoms, the progression, but Silas convinced me it was just a persistent fever, and I believed him because it was easier than believing. He broke off, unable to finish. It's not your fault, Clara said, touching the old doctor's arm. Silas is good at making people doubt their own instincts. What do we do now? Mr. Hutchinson asked. This is proof of murder. We can't just sit on it. We don't intend to. Zeke looked around the circle of faces. But we need to be smart about this. Sheriff Polk won't help us. He's too deep in Silas's pocket. We need to get this evidence to the federal marshal in Helena. That's 5 days away, Sarah pointed out. Silas will know you're gone. He'll either run or destroy any other evidence. Unless we keep him here, Clara said slowly. Unless we give him a reason to stay and fight instead of flee. Everyone turned to look at her. She stood straighter, her jaw set with determination that reminded Zeke powerfully of Thomas. We call the town meeting like we planned. Tomorrow. Ring the church bell and gather everyone. We present the ledger publicly, not the murder page, just the fraud evidence. Let Silas defend himself if he can. That's dangerous, Doc Harmon said. He'll be cornered. Desperate. Exactly. Clara's eyes were bright with purpose. While he's focused on defending himself at the meeting, someone else rides to Helena with the real evidence. The murder charge. By the time Silas realizes what's happening, it'll be too late. Zeke studied her, seeing the plan take shape. It was risky putting Clara in front of Silas and the whole town, making her a target. But it was also smart. Who rides to Helena? I will. Jimmy Winters spoke up, his young voice steady. I'm the fastest rider here, and I know the trails. I can make it in 3 days if I push hard. Jimmy, no, Sarah started, but her son cut her off. Ma, this is important. Mr. Brennan killed Clara's father. He's been stealing from everyone in this town for years. If I can help stop him, he looked at Zeke. I want to help. Zeke saw himself at that age, eager to prove his worth, desperate to do something that mattered. He nodded slowly. All right, but you leave tonight, before anyone knows you're gone, and you take the back trails, stay off the main road. If Silas's men spot you, they won't. Jimmy's face was set with determination that belied his youth. I'll be careful. Sarah looked like she might argue further, but then she just pulled her son into a fierce embrace. You come back safe. You hear me? You come back or I'll never forgive you. I will, Ma, I promise. The next hour was spent in careful preparation. Jimmy packed supplies for the journey, while Zeke wrote out a detailed letter to the federal marshal, including the damning page from the ledger and a full account of Thomas's murder. Doc Harmon added his medical observations about Thomas's symptoms, and Clara wrote a personal testimony about what she'd witnessed and endured. When Jimmy left, slipping out into the darkness with his saddlebags heavy and his purpose clear, Sarah stood at the window watching until he disappeared. He's just a boy, she whispered. He's becoming a man, Zeke said gently, and you raised him right. With Jimmy on his way, the group turned their attention to the town meeting. It would be held at noon the next day, enough time to spread word, but not enough for Silas to prepare a thorough defense. Reverend Clayton had agreed to host it at the church, though he'd made it clear he wanted no part of the actual accusations. Coward, Mrs. Chen muttered. But at least he'll let us use the building. They divided tasks. The Hutchinsons would spread word of the meeting, making sure every family in town knew to attend. Mrs. Chen would make copies of key pages from the ledger. She had beautiful handwriting and a steady hand. Doc Harmon would prepare his testimony about the fraudulent medical expenses Silas had billed to various families. And Sarah would organize the logistics, seating, order of speakers, keeping track of who was willing to testify publicly. Clara and Zeke, meanwhile, would prepare the main presentation, a clear, organized accounting of Silas's crimes that even the most skeptical townsperson couldn't dismiss. As dawn broke, and the others left to begin their preparations, Zeke found himself alone with Clara in the Winters' back room. She was bent over the ledger, making notes, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. I can present the evidence. You don't have to face him. Clara looked up, and her eyes were tired but resolute. Yes, I do. If I hide, if I let fear keep me silent, then he's won. My father taught me that standing up for truth matters more than staying safe. She managed a small smile. Besides, you'll be there. I know you won't let him hurt me. Zeke felt something tighten in his chest, pride, protectiveness, and something deeper he wasn't quite ready to name. No, I won't. But Clara. He hesitated, then pushed forward. After this is over, after Silas faces justice, what will you do? I don't know. Clara closed the ledger, giving him her full attention. I've been so focused on surviving, on fighting back, that I haven't thought about what comes after. I suppose I'll rebuild my parents' cabin, try to make a life here if the town will have me after all this. They'd be lucky to have you. Zeke meant it. You're Thomas's daughter. You've got his courage and his integrity. This town needs people like you. Clara's expression softened. What about you? Will you stay? Or will you go back to your cabin? It was the question Zeke had been avoiding. A week ago, the answer would have been simple, of course. He'd returned to the mountains, to the solitude that had kept him safe for 20 years. But now, with Clara looking at him with those clear eyes, with purpose flowing back into his life like water into a dried riverbed, he wasn't sure. I don't know, he admitted. I'm not the same man I was when I came down here, and I'm not sure that man could go back to hiding. Then don't. Clara reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture natural now. Stay, help me rebuild, help the town heal from what Silas has done. We could. She stopped, as if she'd been about to say something too revealing, and then continued more carefully. We could both use a fresh start. Zeke looked at their joined hands and felt the weight of possibility settling over him. He could stay, could be part of a community again, could maybe, if he was brave enough, build something new from the ruins of his old life. The thought terrified him almost as much as it tempted him. Let's get through today first, he said, squeezing her hand gently. Then we'll figure out tomorrow. Clara nodded, accepting the deflection, and they returned to their preparations. By mid-morning, the word had spread through Pinehaven like wildfire. A town meeting at noon, called by Clara Brennan and some of the other townsfolk. Everyone was invited, encouraged, even to attend. The subject, Silas Brennan's business practices and certain irregularities that had come to light. Silas heard about it, of course. He appeared on the main street just before 11, flanked by Sheriff Polk and 3 of his remaining hired men. He looked like he hadn't slept, his eyes wild, and his usual composure cracking at the edges. "This meeting is illegal," he shouted at anyone who would listen. "I'm Clara's legal guardian, and she's not in her right mind. Whatever she's told you is the ravings of a disturbed girl." But people kept walking toward the church, their faces set with determination. The Hutchinsons, Mrs. Chen, young couples and old-timers. Even some of the families who owed Silas money came, perhaps sensing that his power was finally breaking. Inside the church, Reverend Clayton rang the bell at precisely noon. The sound echoed across the valley, loud and clear and final. It was a call to witness, to judgment, to the moment when a community would finally decide whether to stand up or continue looking away. Zeke stood near the back, his hand resting on his gun belt. Not threatening, but ready. He'd positioned himself where he could see all the entrances, where he could move quickly if Silas tried anything. Clara sat at the front, the ledger beside her, surrounded by Doc Harmon, Sarah, and the others who'd agreed to testify. The church filled rapidly, people crowding into pews and standing along the walls. Silas entered last, with Sheriff Polk and his men taking a position opposite Zeke. The 2 men locked eyes across the room, and Zeke saw calculation there, and desperation, and the cold awareness that this was the end of something. Reverend Clayton called for order, his voice shaking but audible. "We're here today because members of our community have raised concerns about certain business practices. This is not a legal proceeding. It's simply a chance for people to speak their truth and for others to listen." He looked pointedly at Silas. "Everyone will have a chance to respond." Doc Harmon stood first, his medical bag at his feet like a shield. "My name is Samuel Harmon. I've been the doctor in this town for 40 years. And I'm here to testify that Silas Brennan has been systematically defrauding the families I serve." A murmur ran through the crowd. Silas opened his mouth to object, but Reverend Clayton held up his hand. "Let him finish, Mr. Brennan. You'll have your turn." Doc Harmon pulled out his records, his hands steady now that the moment had come. "I have here medical bills that Mr. Doc to pay." Brennan claimed to pay on behalf of various families, charging them interest on those payments. But when I checked my own records, I found that many of these bills were never actually paid. He collected the money from the families, but never paid me. That's fraud. More murmurs, louder now. People were looking at each other, recognition dawning. How many of them had been victims of similar schemes? Mrs. Chen stood next. "I borrowed $200 from Mr. Brennan 5 years ago to repair my laundry after a fire. The terms were clear, 10% interest, to be paid off in 3 years. But when I tried to pay off the loan last year, Mr. Brennan claimed I still owed $400. When I asked to see the paperwork, he told me I'd signed for compound interest, even though I know I didn't." She held up a document. "This is my copy of the agreement. It says simple interest. Someone changed the terms." The crowd was restless now, angry. More people stood, one by one, telling their stories. Land seized for missed payments that had actually been made, interest rates that mysteriously doubled, loans that never seemed to decrease no matter how much was paid. A pattern emerged, clear and damning, of systematic theft dressed up as legitimate business. Finally, Clara stood. The room went quiet, everyone turning to look at Thomas Brennan's daughter. She held the ledger in her hands, and her voice when she spoke was strong and clear. "My name is Clara Brennan. Silas Brennan is my uncle, and for 3 years I've lived in his house. I've seen things, heard things, and recently I found this." She held up the ledger. "It's my uncle's private record of his transactions, real transactions, the ones he didn't want anyone else to see." Silas stood abruptly. "That's stolen property. You had no right. I had every right." Clara's voice rang out, silencing him. "My father's name is in this book. My name is in this book. And so are yours." She looked around the room, meeting eyes. "All of you. Every person he's cheated, every family he's hurt, it's all documented here." In his own handwriting, she began reading. Names, dates, amounts, real figures compared to falsified ones. The discrepancies were staggering, the theft systematic and extensive. As she read, faces in the crowd went from shock to anger to grim determination. When she finished, Clara closed the ledger and looked directly at Silas. "You took advantage of this town's trust. You stole from people who could barely afford it. You destroyed lives and livelihoods. And you did it all while pretending to be a pillar of the community." Silas's face was purple with rage. "You ungrateful little, I took you in when you had nothing. I fed you, clothed you. You beat me," Clara said quietly, and the church went absolutely silent. "You locked me in my room. You tried to sell me to a stranger. And worst of all," her voice broke, but she pushed through, "you killed my father." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Silas went white, then red, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. That's insane. Thomas died of fever. Everyone knows that. Did he?" Clara's eyes were bright with tears, but her voice was steady. "Or did you poison him slowly, over months, so you could take control of his daughter and her inheritance?" Silas laughed, but it was a wild, desperate sound. "You can't prove that. You can't prove any of this." "Actually," Zeke said, stepping forward, "we can. And we have. The evidence has already been sent to the federal marshal in Helena. He'll be here in 3 days. And when he arrives, you're going to have to answer for a lot more than fraud." The room erupted, people shouting, demanding answers, calling for justice. Silas looked around wildly, seeing his power crumbling, his carefully constructed empire collapsing. Sheriff Polk had backed away, his hand noticeably far from his weapon, clearly unwilling to go down with Silas. And then Silas did something that surprised everyone. He smiled. Zeke moved like lightning, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides. He caught Clara as she fell, rolling her to safety behind a pew, then surged upward toward Silas. The older man tried to bring his gun around, but Zeke was faster, grabbing Silas's wrist and twisting hard. The gun discharged, the shot deafening in the enclosed space, but the bullet went wild, splintering wood in the church ceiling. People screamed and dove for cover. Zeke slammed Silas's gun hand against the doorframe once, twice, and the weapon clattered to the floor. But Silas wasn't done. He was a desperate man, and desperate men fought dirty. He drove his knee up toward Zeke's groin, and when Zeke twisted to avoid it, Silas's other hand came up holding a knife, small but deadly, the kind of weapon a man kept hidden for emergencies. The blade flashed toward Zeke's ribs. He caught Silas's wrist barely in time, and the two men grappled, crashing into pews and scattering hymnals. Silas fought with the strength of panic, clawing and striking, but Zeke fought with something colder and more controlled, the muscle memory of a man who'd survived countless fights and wasn't about to lose this one. "You should have stayed in your mountains," Silas snarled, spittle flying. "Should have let her rot. Should have." Zeke twisted, using Silas's momentum against him, and drove him backward into the wall. The knife fell from Silas's grip, and Zeke's fist connected with the older man's jaw once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Silas slumped, and Zeke caught him by the shirt front, holding him up. "I made a promise to Thomas," Zeke said, his voice low and hard. "And I told you what would happen if you hurt her again." He drew back his fist for what would have been a killing blow, 20 years of rage and grief and pain channeled into one moment. "Zeke, stop!" Clara's voice cut through the red haze of his anger. She stood behind him, her hand on his arm, and her touch was enough to make him pause. "Please, don't kill him. Not like this." Zeke looked back at her, saw the tears on her face, but also the steadiness in her eyes. She'd been through hell, had every right to want Silas dead, but she was choosing something else, choosing to be better than the man who'd hurt her. "He deserves it," Zeke said, but his grip on Silas loosened slightly. "Maybe he does." Clara's voice was soft but certain. "But my father wouldn't have wanted this. He'd want justice, real justice, not vengeance." Zeke held her gaze for a long moment, then looked at Silas's battered face. The man was conscious, but barely, blood streaming from his nose and mouth, his eyes glazed with pain and defeat. He wasn't a threat anymore. He was just a broken old man who'd built an empire on lies and was watching it crumble. Zeke released him with a shove, and Silas collapsed to the floor. Marshal Davis moved forward immediately, pulling out iron shackles and securing Silas's wrists behind his back. "Silas Brennan, you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Brennan, multiple counts of fraud, assault, and attempted kidnapping. Anything you say." But Silas wasn't listening. He was staring at Clara with something that might have been hatred or might have been desperate, futile regret. "I gave you everything," he whispered, "took you in, protected you." "You hurt me," Clara said simply. "You killed my father. And you would have destroyed my life if you'd been allowed to continue." She crouched down to his level, and her voice was steady as stone. "I'm glad you're going to pay for what you've done. But I'm not going to let what you did define me. I'm Thomas Brennan's daughter, and I'm going to live the life he wanted for me. A good life, a free life." She stood and walked back to Zeke, taking his hand. Around them, the church was in chaos, people talking over each other, some crying, some angry, all of them processing what they'd just witnessed. Sheriff Polk stood to the side, looking smaller somehow, his authority diminished by his association with Silas. Marshal Davis hauled Silas to his feet. "I'll need statements from everyone. Miss Brennan, Mr. Coleridge, Doc Harmon, you'll need to come to the sheriff's office and give official testimony." "Sheriff, Polk won't be there," a voice called out. It was Mr. Hutchinson, standing with several other men. "We'll be holding an emergency town council meeting tonight to discuss his removal." Seems pretty clear he wasn't doing his job. Polk opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. He unpinned his badge with shaking hands and set it on a pew. "I didn't know about the murder," he said quietly. "I swear I didn't know. But I knew about the fraud, knew about the beatings, and I looked away because it was easier." He looked at Clara. "I'm sorry, Miss Brennan. For whatever it's worth, I'm sorry." Clara nodded but didn't respond. Some apologies came too late to matter. As the marshal led Silas out of the church, the crowd parted to let them through. People stared at Silas, this man who'd controlled them through fear and debt for so long, and saw him for what he truly was. Not powerful, not untouchable. Just a criminal in chains, heading for the justice he'd spent years avoiding. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and warm. Zeke and Clara stood on the church steps, watching as the marshal loaded Silas into a wagon for transport to Helena. Around them, townspeople were gathering in small groups, processing what had happened, beginning the slow work of healing and rebuilding. Sarah Winters approached with Jimmy, who looked like he might fall asleep standing up. "You did good, son," she said, hugging him fiercely. "So good. Is it over?" Jimmy asked, looking between Zeke and Clara. "Is it really over?" Zeke glanced at Clara, who smiled a real smile, the first he'd seen from her that wasn't shadowed by fear or pain. "Yeah," he said. "It's over." Doc Harmon joined them, looking older and more tired than Zeke had ever seen him. "I'll be giving my statement to the marshal tonight. About Thomas's symptoms, about my suspicions, about all the times I should have spoken up and didn't." He met Clara's eyes. "I failed your father, and I failed you. I hope someday you can forgive me." Clara took the old doctor's hand. "You got word to Zeke when it mattered. You stood up today when you could have stayed silent. That counts for something." They stood together as the sun moved lower in the sky, as the wagon carrying Silas Brennan rumbled out of Pinehaven toward Helena and the reckoning that awaited him there. And Clara felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years, something she'd almost forgotten existed. Peace, safety, and the tentative, trembling hope of a future that was finally, truly hers. Marshal Davis would stay in Pinehaven for 3 days, collecting evidence and statements. The ledger would become official evidence in what he predicted would be one of the most significant fraud cases Montana Territory had seen. Additional victims would come forward not just from Pinehaven, but from surrounding towns, and the full scope of Silas's crimes would be documented and prosecuted. But that would all come later. For now, in this moment, standing in the afternoon light with Zeke beside her and the weight of fear finally lifted from her shoulders, Clara Brennan simply breathed. She was free. Her father's killer would face justice, and the man who'd kept his promise, who'd come down from the mountains to protect her, stood steady and solid at her side. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. 6 weeks later, Clara stood on the foundation of what would become her new home. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and freshly cut timber. Around her, a small crew of townspeople worked sawing boards, hammering nails, calling to each other with the easy camaraderie of neighbors helping neighbors. The land had been returned to her officially, along with her inheritance and restitution from Silas's seized assets. The town council had voted unanimously to grant her the plot where her parents' original cabin had stood, and they'd done more than that. They'd organized work parties, donated materials, and turned the rebuilding of Clara Brennan's home into a community project, part apology, part healing, part hope for a better future. Zeke worked alongside them, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hands busy with familiar work. He'd been in Pinehaven for 6 weeks now, the longest he'd stayed in any town since Emily died, and Clara had watched him slowly, carefully, begin to rejoin the world he'd left behind. It wasn't always easy for him. She'd seen the moments when the crowds or the noise became too much, when he'd step away and stare at the mountains with something like longing. But he always came back, always returned to the work, to the people, to her. "Miss Brennan, Mr." Hutchinson called from the partially raised wall. "We're ready to set the main beam. Want to do the honors?" Clara smiled and walked over, placing her hands on the heavy timber alongside the others. "On three," she called. "1, 2, 3. They lifted together, muscles straining, and the beam rose into place with a solid thunk. A cheer went up, and someone produced a flask for celebrating, passing it around while others clapped Clara on the back. Doc Harmon, who'd been supervising from a folding chair, raised the flask in salute. "To Thomas Brennan's daughter. May her home be filled with as much love and laughter as his was." "To Clara," the group echoed, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes, good tears, this time tears of gratitude and belonging. As the afternoon wore on and the work continued, Sarah Winters brought out baskets of food, sandwiches and cold chicken, and the apple pie she was famous for. The workers broke for lunch, sitting in the shade and talking about everything and nothing. Jimmy Winters entertained them with an increasingly embellished account of his ride to meet the Marshal's patrol, and Clara listened with amusement as the story grew more dramatic with each telling. Marshal Davis had returned to Helena 2 weeks ago, taking Silas with him. The trial would be held in the spring, and Clara would have to testify, but the marshal had assured her the case was solid. Between the ledger, the medical evidence, and the testimony of dozens of victims, Silas Brennan would spend the rest of his life in prison if he wasn't hanged first. Clara found she had surprisingly little feeling about it one way or the other. Silas had been a shadow over her life for 3 years, but now that the shadow was gone, she discovered she didn't want to waste any more time thinking about him. She had too much living to do. After lunch, as the others returned to work, Zeke found Clara sitting on a stack of lumber, looking out at the mountains. He sat beside her, comfortable with the silence between them in a way few people ever achieved. "Your father would be proud," Zeke said finally, "of how you stood up to Silas, of how you're rebuilding. I couldn't have done it without you." Clara looked at him. This man who'd become so central to her life that she could barely remember what it felt like before he was there. "You kept your promise to him. You protected me. You." She hesitated, then decided honesty was worth the risk. "You gave me my life back." Zeke shifted uncomfortably, never quite knowing how to handle gratitude or sentiment. "I just did what needed doing." "Is that all it was?" Clara asked softly. "Just keeping a promise?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Clara waited, giving him time. Finally, he said, "At first, maybe, but somewhere along the way, he stopped, seeming to wrestle with words that didn't come easily. You reminded me what it feels like to care about someone, to want to protect them not out of duty, but because the thought of anything happening to them is unbearable." Clara's heart beat faster. "And that scares you?" "Terrifies me," Zeke admitted. "Last time I cared that much, I lost everything, thought it would kill me, and I've been hiding from that pain for 20 years. What changed?" Zeke looked at her directly, and his eyes held a warmth she'd only seen hints of before. "You did. You're Thomas's daughter. You've got his courage, his integrity, his stubborn refusal to stay down when life knocks you over. But you're also your own person, strong and smart and braver than you know." He paused. "And somewhere between the cabin and here, I stopped being the man who was just keeping a promise. I became the man who wants to be part of your future." Clara felt tears threatening again, but these were different tears of joy, so acute it almost hurt. "I want that too," she said. "I want you to stay. Not just for a while, but—" She took a breath. "I want to build this life with you, Zeke, if you'll have me. Have you?" Zeke's laugh was soft and disbelieving. "Clara, I'm 26 years older than you. I'm set in my ways, difficult, better with silence than conversation. You could do a lot better than—" Clara stopped him with a kiss. It was brief, chaste, but it said everything words couldn't. When she pulled back, Zeke looked stunned. "I don't want better," Clara said firmly. I want you, the man who came down from the mountains when I needed him, the man who taught me to shoot and showed me that trust is possible even after it's been broken, the man my father chose to protect me because he knew that under all that armor you were the best man he'd ever known." Zeke closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with emotion he'd kept locked away for too long. "I don't deserve you." "Maybe not," Clara agreed, taking his hand. "But I'm choosing you anyway, if you'll choose me back." Zeke looked at their joined hands, then at the half-built cabin, then at the mountains that had been his home for so long, and he made a choice, not the safe choice, not the easy one, but the choice that meant opening himself up to risk and loss and all the messy complications of loving someone. "I choose you," he said. "God help me. I choose you and this life and all of it." They sat together as the afternoon stretched toward evening, watching the cabin take shape. Around them, the community that had found its voice again worked with purpose and joy, and Clara understood something her father had tried to teach her years ago, that the hardest thing about surviving tragedy isn't just enduring it. It's finding the courage to live fully again afterward. 3 months later, on a cold December morning, Clara and Zeke were married in the same church where she'd confronted Silas. The whole town attended, and Sarah Winters cried through the entire ceremony. Doc Harmon gave Clara away, his hand steady on her arm as they walked down the aisle. The cabin was finished by then, sturdy and warm, with windows that looked out on the mountains and a porch where they could sit in the evenings. Clara had started teaching at the small schoolhouse, working with children whose families had been helped by Silas's downfall. Zeke had taken on work as a guide for settlers coming through the territory, using his knowledge of the mountains to help others find safe passage. They'd built something together, not just a home, but a life. And on the nights when Zeke would wake from old nightmares, Clara would be there to remind him he wasn't alone. And on the days when Clara's memories threatened to pull her under, Zeke would be there to anchor her in the present. They'd both been broken, both been lost. But together, slowly, they'd found their way to something that looked surprisingly like happiness. Years later, when people in Pinehaven told the story of Clara Brennan and the mountain man who came to her rescue, they'd talk about courage and justice and the importance of speaking truth to power. They'd talk about how one young woman's refusal to stay silent had exposed corruption and changed their town forever. But they'd also talk about something else, about how the worst monsters can wear familiar faces, about how the best heroes often stand quiet in the margins until the moment they're needed most, and about how, when that moment comes, they don't just act, they transform everything around them. And they'd talk about love, the kind that comes not from perfect circumstances, but from two scarred souls who chose to trust again, to hope again, to build something beautiful from the ruins of what had been lost. Sometimes the worst monsters wear familiar faces and sit at the family table. But sometimes, too, the strongest bonds are forged in the hardest fires. And sometimes the promise made to a dying friend becomes the foundation for a love that heals not just two people, but an entire community. That was the real story of Clara Brennan and Ezekiel Coleridge. Not just a story of rescue, but of redemption. Not just of survival, but of the courage to truly live. And in the end, that made all the difference.